Hi everyone, my name is Alicia. This is a pre-recorded presentation for the 2021 meeting of the Australasian Mathematical Psychology Conference. Today I'll be talking about a Bayesian multi-level modelling approach to studying individual differences in automatic imitation. So to start off, I'd like to talk about some well-established effects in the cognitive psychology literature. Some examples I'm sure you're familiar with are the Stroop task, the Posner queuing task, the Navon task, and the Eriksson-Flanker task. So for example, the Posner queuing task, in this task, participants are instructed to respond to a target that appears at a location that is either congruent or incongruent to the direction of the arrow. And this Posner queuing task, and the others listed here, are based on a stimulus response compatibility paradigm. The effect that is measured is essentially the mean difference between the incongruent and the congruent reaction times. These group level effects have been replicated consistently over the years and have shown to be very robust. One concern that has been raised about these paradigms in recent years, however, is that although these paradigms show very robust group level effects, they also show very low test-retest reliabilities. For example, the overall group level effects may be consistent across sessions, but an individual participant's effect and ranked order from one session to another might not be consistent. This makes it very difficult to study individual differences and effects between participants. While increasing sample sizes can help to overcome these low reliabilities, this is not always practical. So, for example, in neuroimaging studies, resources are often limited and large samples cannot always be tested. And with clinical studies, the number of participants with a particular clinical condition can itself be very limited. And as a result of this paradox, many researchers have deemed these behavioral paradigms to be unfit for studying individual differences. For example, if you're trying to study personality differences. An alternative solution to this paradox has recently been proposed by Haynes and colleagues, who suggest that the solution may actually lie in the method of analysis rather than in how the data is collected. So in contrast to the traditional summary statistic approach, they propose a multi-level modelling approach that yields higher test-retest reliabilities, improves statistical inference, and opens the possibility of studying individual differences within these cognitive behavioural paradigms. So on the left here, you can see an example of a single participant's reaction time data in an experiment across 6 trials. In a summary statistic approach, the reaction times would be averaged across trials for the congruent and incongruent conditions, and these two means for each participant would then be inputted into a statistical model for analysis. The statistical inference you can make using this approach is relatively weak. So you can only conclude that there was, for example, a 210 millisecond difference in reaction time as a result of the manipulation. And by using summary statistics only, this approach completely ignores the variance in each individual's pattern of reaction times and ignores important information about the shape of a distribution, such as patterns of skew. This approach is quite problematic given that the same mean can be produced by many different distributions of data, making it difficult to make precise statistical inferences about the underlying psychological mechanism behind these paradigms. So in contrast to this average in test approach, Haynes and his colleagues propose a multi-level model approach, which takes into account both group level and individual level uncertainties within a single model. So rather than taking only these two means for each participant, this approach inputs all the available data into the model. By acknowledging the hierarchical structure of the data and including all the data within the model in this way, this approach actually allows for more precise estimates of difference scores and yields much higher test-retest reliabilities. Rauder and Half in 2019 suggested that this greater precision and higher test-retest reliabilities makes this multi-level modelling approach ideal for studying individual differences. So the aim of the present study is to apply this multi-level modelling solution to existing data collected from 3 large sample experiments which investigated individual differences. The task used in this dataset by Dada, Butler, and Ramsey was an automatic imitation task, which, like the Posner queuing task, is based on a stimulus response compatibility paradigm. So we aim to compare and contrast the summary statistics approach and the multi-level modelling approach, we want to find out whether there are any meaningful differences in the results, or whether we might be able to confirm the findings of Data et al. Using a more valid analytical method. I'd like to also note here that data analysis is still in progress, so what I'll be presenting today will have a greater focus on the methods and my plan of analysis rather than the full results. So just to reiterate, Data et al.'s paper used the traditional summary statistic approach and used the average reaction times for the compatible and the incompatible conditions for analysis, and this involved 2x2 mixed ANOVAs and multiple regression analyses. The present study, in contrast, used Bayesian multi-level modelling. So I'd like to go through the dataset that we're using here. So Data et al.'s dataset involved 3 large-scale experiments with roughly 600 participants in total. For this presentation, I'll just be focusing on one, so the sample size was about 201. The task used was an automatic imitation task, which attempts to measure automatic imitation, which is a phenomenon in which people tend to spontaneously represent others' behaviours and copy body posture, gestures, or other behaviours. Research has suggested that this phenomenon enhances rapport and feelings of affiliation during social interactions. Like many of the other cognitive tasks I've mentioned already, this works by a stimulus-response compatibility paradigm. So here is an example of what a participant would see in a task. So there would be a hand on the screen. The hand, a number would appear, either a 1 or a 2. If a 1 appears, participants are asked to lift their index finger. If a 2 appears, they're asked to lift their middle finger. And in the background here, of course, there's a hand stimulus that participants are told not to pay any attention to, but the finger lifted by the stimulus is either compatible to the number or incompatible to the number. Essentially, reaction times are slowed in an incompatible condition when imitation must be inhibited. The imitative compatibility effect here is simply that difference score in the reaction times between incompatible and compatible. In the literature, this compatibility effect has been argued to index the inhibition of automatic copying of other people's behaviours. In particular, this dataset was also looking for any individual differences in this compatibility effect. For example, the sex of participants, whether males or females show greater imitation, personality differences. For example, with empathy, it's been speculated that more empathic people are more likely to imitate, as well as in-group biases. So, for example, females may imitate more when presented with a female hand compared to a male one. So for the analysis that we used Bayesian multi-level modelling, which was carried out in R in accordance to McIlwraith's recent book, Statistical Rethinking. And we also used Berkner's BRMS modelling package. So McIlwraith's methods were carried out in STAN, but we used Solomon Kurz's bookdown, which translated these methods into BRMS. And BRMS is simply an interface for STAN, which is a programming suite that enables multi-level modelling. It uses a similar syntax to LME4, which many of you are probably more familiar with. However, whilst LME4 and BRMS look similar on the surface, LME4 operates within a frequentist framework, and BRMS operates within a Bayesian one, and is also powered by STAN. So I'll just present a little of the results I have so far for Model 12, which was the final model for the imitative compatibility analyses. In accordance to Barr et al. 2013, we used a maximal model approach, in which we included the maximum number of varying effects as permitted by the design. The key factors that we were interested in were the imitative compatibility effects, the sex of the participants, and the sex of the hand stimulus. We also had varying effects at both the participant and the stimulus levels. We used a shifted log normal distribution to model reaction times, as has been recommended by the literature, and also weakly informative priors in our model. So here we have a coefficient plot which shows the parameter estimates of the posterior distributions in the model for the fixed effects. The x-axis represents the parameter estimates of reaction times in the log normal scale, and the vertical grey line represents 0. So here I'd just like to focus on a few of the key effects. The first is participant sex. So we can see here that females are generally much slower in the task than males, and this is in response to the task as a whole. The second is what we're interested in, so the imitative compatibility effect. From the positive estimate here, you can see that the incompatible condition is slower than the compatible condition. This effect is also quite small, as expected from the literature, which has generally found the compatibility effect in this automatic imitation task to be around 10 milliseconds or so. The final effect that is most important here is this interaction between participant sex and compatibility. And here we find no interaction effect, so male and female participants show no difference in the imitative compatibility effect. Again, this is expected from the original Data et al. Paper, which also found no sex difference in the automatic imitation task. So what can we conclude from this approach? First is that this multi-level modelling approach does have benefits for studying individual differences, especially for other reaction time tasks that are based on the stimulus-response compatibility paradigm. Second is that by applying this more valid analytical approach to one such task, in this case an automatic imitation task, we were able to provide stronger support for the claims made in Data et al.'s paper, which used a summary statistics approach. In this case, we can confirm that there's a small imitative compatibility effect, and that there's also no difference between male and female participants in this imitation effect. As I mentioned earlier, data analysis is still in progress, and there are still several more steps in this project. The first, of course, is to look at personality differences in the automatic imitation task. We're particularly interested in empathy, agreeableness, extroversion, autistic-like traits, narcissism, and schizotypal traits. And we also want to look at spatial compatibility as opposed to imitative compatibility. So for example, comparing reaction times when the finger the stimulus lifts is on the same or different side as the participant's finger. And there are still two further experiments in Data et al.'s dataset, each with roughly 200 participants each. So these ones look at the imitative compatibility effect within a social versus non-social context, as well as the imitation effect when the hand stimuli are presented orthogonally. Thank you all very much for your time. I'd just like to thank Kohinoor Data and Richard Ramsey for their work in this project, and of course the rest of the Social Brain in Action Lab here at Macquarie University in Sydney, as well as overseas in Wales and Scotland.